Hello friends, welcome to Historical Pulse on this channel. You will see the video about the world top in history on this channel. Your knowledge will be increased and your mind will be refreshed. Let's view the video. The Russo-Japanese War, the road to war, imperial ambitions clash. At the turn of the 20th century, two empires, one rising, one declining, set their sights. The Tokugawa shogunate had transformed itself into a modern industrial power after the Meiji Restoration of 1868. Meanwhile, Russia, a sprawling empire obsessed with warm water ports, was expanding eastward, dreaming of dominance in Manchuria and Korea. These two powers were on a collision course. Japan, after defeating China in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894-1895, gained Taiwan and influence in Korea. But Japan's victory was short-lived. Russia, along with France and Germany, pressured Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula in what became known as the Triple Intervention. To Japan, it felt like bullying by the Western powers, and it planted seeds of resentment. While Japan seethed, Russia was busy building the Trans-Siberian Railway and establishing its naval stronghold at Port Arthur, on the very peninsula Japan had been forced to give up. Russia also began meddling in Korean affairs, something Japan considered a direct threat. By the early 1900s, tensions were boiling. Diplomats tried to negotiate. Japan offered to recognize Russian influence in Manchuria if Russia would stay out of Korea. But the Russians, underestimating Japan, stalled and dismissed the offer, believing they were dealing with an inferior Asian power. Japan wasn't weak. It had a modern army, a powerful navy, and a government willing to go to war to protect its interests. By early 1904, Japan had had enough. It broke off diplomatic talks and prepared to strike. On February 8, 1904, without a formal declaration of war, Japanese torpedo boats launched a surprise night attack on the Russian fleet anchored at Port Arthur. Just hours later, Japan formally declared war. The Russo-Japanese War had begun. Not just a battle for territory, but a war that would shock the world, shatter myths about Asian military inferiority, and lay the groundwork for revolutions, alliances, and future global conflict. Surprise at sea. The attack on Port Arthur faded into the dark waters off the coast of Manchuria, February 1904. It was a moonless night when torpedoes cut through the cold sea, aimed at the heart of the Russian Pacific Fleet. Japan wasn't just declaring war, it was redefining modern naval warfare. The Japanese Navy, led by Admiral Togo Heihachiro, had studied the tactics of European powers, but now they were ready to show the world they could play the same game and win. Their first move? A sneak attack. At around 10:30 p.m. on February 8th, Japanese destroyers launched a surprise torpedo strike against the Russian fleet docked at Port Arthur, a key naval base on the Liaodong Peninsula. The goal was simple: cripple the Russian Navy before it could even leave the harbor. The attack damaged several key Russian ships, including the battleships Retvizan and Tsarevich. Though not completely successful in destroying the fleet, the strike sent a powerful message: Japan would fight dirty and smart. But the real battle was just beginning. Over the following weeks, Japan imposed a naval blockade on Port Arthur. Russian ships tried to break out, but the Japanese Navy held the upper hand. Using superior tactics and mobility, they forced the Russian fleet into a defensive posture. Admiral Togo, commanding from his flagship Mikasa, kept up the pressure, with relentless bombardments and cunning feints. Meanwhile, the Russian commanders were plagued by indecision and poor communication. Orders were delayed, morale was low, and Russian leadership in the Far East seemed paralyzed. To make matters worse, the Russian ships were often obsolete compared to Japan's newer, faster warships. And Japanese sailors were better trained, more disciplined, and, frankly, more motivated. This wasn't just about pride, it was about national survival. On land, Japanese forces began the siege of Port Arthur, slowly tightening their grip on the fortress. But at sea, the initiative remained firmly in Japan's hands. They controlled the waters, the supply lines, and soon, the future of the war. Around the world, military analysts watched in disbelief. A non-Western power had launched a modern naval assault, and it was working. Western nations had long believed Japan couldn't challenge a European empire. The attack on Port Arthur wasn't just the opening move of the war, it was a strategic masterstroke. It shattered the illusion of Russian invincibility and forced the world to take Japan seriously as a global power. The Battle of Mukden and the bloody fields of Manchuria. Battles on land. Mukden and the Manchurian Campaign War. Of attrition begins. As Japan secured dominance at sea, it turned its focus to the land. In April 1904, Japanese troops landed in Korea and began pushing north toward Russian positions in Manchuria. The terrain was unforgiving, dusty plains, bitter winters, and vast distances. Both armies were about to engage in one of the first modern wars of the 20th century. The Battle of Liaoyang. The first major land clash came at Liaoyang in August 1904. Japanese General Oyama Iwao led nearly 130,000 troops against Russian General Kuropatkin's 160,000. The battle raged for over 2 weeks. Artillery thundered. Day and night, trenches were dug, and thousands fell in brutal charges. Despite their larger numbers, Russian forces were outmaneuvered. Kuropatkin, cautious and indecisive, retreated north, handing Japan its first major land victory. Liaoyang signaled that this war wouldn't be won with sheer numbers. It would be won with mobility, coordination, and morale. Siege and fall of Port Arthur. While the main army pushed through Manchuria, another Japanese force laid siege to Port Arthur. The fortress, defended by tens of thousands of Russians and ringed with concrete bunkers and artillery, became a symbol of resistance. Japanese assaults were fierce and costly. In one attack, over 15,000 Japanese soldiers fell in just a few days, but Japan persisted. By December 1904, the key 203-meter hill was taken, allowing Japanese artillery to bombard the harbor directly. Russian ships were blown apart in their docks. On January 2, 1905, Port Arthur surrendered. The impregnable fortress had fallen. The loss crushed Russian morale. The Great Battle of Mukden. Then came Mukden, the largest land battle of the war. Over 600,000 troops clashed across a 50-mile front. Trenches, machine guns, and massive artillery bombardments made it resemble the battles of World War I a decade early. Japan launched flanking attacks to surround the Russian army. Fighting was chaotic, bloody, and relentless. Though the Japanese army was stretched thin and low on supplies, Kuropatkin's indecision cost the Russians dearly. By March 1905, Russian troops retreated once again. Mukden was a decisive Japanese victory, one that left the Russian army in tatters and the Tsar's confidence shaken. A new kind of warfare. The Manchurian campaign was unlike anything the world had seen. The Russo-Japanese War was no colonial skirmish. It was an industrial war with machine guns, barbed wire, railroads, and trenches. The cost was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of men were killed or wounded. Both sides suffered, but Japan kept the initiative. The world was beginning to realize this wasn't just a regional conflict. It was a signal that warfare had entered a terrifying new era. Tsushima, naval supremacy redefined. Russia's desperate gamble. With its Pacific fleet destroyed and Port Arthur fallen, Russia had one last hope, the Baltic Fleet. In an astonishing move, the Tsar ordered it to sail halfway around the world to relieve pressure in the east. It was a logistical nightmare. The journey took over 7 months, from the Baltic Sea, around Africa, all the way to the Sea of Japan. The Russian fleet was outdated, poorly trained, and morale was dismal. Sailors suffered from disease, heat, and exhaustion. By the time they arrived in May 1905, Admiral Togo Haihachiro was ready. The trap is set. Togo anticipated where the Russians would enter, through the Tsushima Strait. He had superior Ships, better armor, more accurate gunnery, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. As the Russian fleet entered the strait on May 27th, the Japanese sprang the trap. Japanese battleships opened fire with devastating precision. One by one, Russian ships were set ablaze. Chaos erupted. Smoke filled the air. Japanese torpedo boats darted between hulking vessels, striking at weak points. The Russians could barely return fire. A total annihilation. In 2 days, the Russian fleet was virtually annihilated. Out of 38 ships, only a few escaped. Over 4,000 Russian sailors were killed and nearly 7,000 captured. Japan lost just 3 torpedo boats. This wasn't just a victory. It was a transformation of naval warfare. The age of the armored battleship had arrived, and Japan was now one of its masters. Shockwaves. Around the world. News of Tsushima stunned the globe. A non-European nation had destroyed one of Europe's great naval fleets. In London, Paris, and Berlin, military officials scrambled to rethink their strategies. In Russia, the loss triggered outrage. The people had grown tired of war, and the government's humiliation at sea only fueled the revolutionary fires already smoldering at home. Tsushima proved one thing beyond doubt. Japan was no longer just a regional player. It was now a world-class military power, capable of reshaping global geopolitics. Peace and aftermath. A new power rises. The road to peace. With its army in retreat and navy destroyed, Russia was forced to negotiate. The war was bleeding the empire dry, and unrest was rising back home. Japan, too, was exhausted, its economy straining under the cost of war. Enter U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, who offered to mediate peace talks. The negotiations took place in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in the summer of 1905. After weeks of tense discussion, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. Russia agreed to withdraw from southern Manchuria and ceded the southern half of Sakhalin Island to Japan. Most importantly, Japan gained dominance in Korea. Roosevelt would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his role, but Japan wasn't entirely satisfied. They expected more. Still, it was a clear political and military victory. A shift in the global order. Japan had done what no Asian nation had ever done before, defeated a major European power in modern war. It gained respect, recognition, and territory, but it also gained ambition. For Russia, the defeat was catastrophic. It sparked the 1905 Russian Revolution, pushing Tsar Nicholas II to grant reforms, including the creation of the Duma. The war exposed the weaknesses of the Russian Empire and planted seeds of future unrest. A legacy of conflict. The Russo-Japanese War set the tone for the 20th century. It was a preview of the brutal, industrialized warfare that would define World War I. It also began Japan's rise as an imperial power, one that would have dramatic consequences in the decades to come. The world had changed, and the rising sun of Japan was now impossible to ignore.